Hello and welcome. I'm Chuck Wald, a proud veteran, retired general, and board member of the Electrification Coalition. Thank you for joining our fourth annual Veterans for EV webinar. The Electrification Coalition is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that works to accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles to overcome the economic and national security challenges that have long stemmed from the U.S. transportation sector dependent on oil, while also confronting the risks of allowing a new set of foreign actors to dominate the technology required for the growth of EVs. The EC was founded with a focus on EVs as a national security solution. Our sister organization, SAFE, has long advocated for increasing our nation's energy security. And together with other retired military officers and business leaders who constitute the Energy Security Leadership Council, we've been consistent voices in support of the development of the technology to break oil's monopoly on our transportation system. As we consider the importance of the auto industry for our nation, we must also position our nation to own the EV transition. The question isn't if EVs are the future, it's a question of when, and more a question of who will benefit economically from the new technology. The EC's work includes state, federal, and local policy programs. We wrote the first EV roadmap 15 years ago. Our more recent federal engagement includes support for the EV programs within the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, while our partners at SAFE also advocate for the program that became the CHIPS and Science Act. After passage of the IRA and BIL, we launched the EV Funding Finder and other programs to help the public and private sectors navigate transportation electrification support that those laws created, leading to billions of dollars of funding for EV programs. The EC believes in the power of convening to energize networks. We work with corporate leaders in our EC Business Council, which brings together those who make EVs and their charging platforms, and those who are using the vehicles, from Ford to FedEx. A few years back, we launched our Veterans for EVs initiative, connecting the ESLC, with the former rank and file military members who are helping lead the EV transition. EV sales are growing. As more and more consumers are choosing to take advantage of this money-saving technological advance, cutting their fuel costs roughly in half and ending oil changes and enjoying the savings of the maintenance costs. In the decade from 2013 to 2023, global EV sales skyrocketed from less than 1/3% of new car sales to nearly 1/5 of the global auto market. During this phenomenal growth, the industry is making huge advances in manufacturing technology. The battery in today's Tesla cost roughly $14,000. To get the same capacity battery in the 2010 Tesla would have cost $139,000. Developing a strong EV market in the United States is essential because doing so will allow American automotive industry to retain its role as a key driver of the American manufacturing economy. The U.S. automotive industry adds nearly $600 billion annually to our GDP and employs almost 5 million workers. In the past decade, U.S. automakers have exported more than $1 trillion in vehicles and parts. The American automotive industry buys hundreds of billions of dollars worth of American steel, glass, rubber, iron, and semiconductors each year, and ranks third out of the 40 largest industries in the R&D spending. The continued success of the industry is vital to the strength of the American manufacturing economy. The U.S. auto industry is leaning into the EV transition, and over $200 billion in private investments and over 200,000 jobs have been announced across the country. But if the United States fails to keep pace with the aggressive EV effort offered by other world powers, it would all but guarantee that the American auto industry faces then an inevitable decline as European and Chinese manufacturers secure control over the auto industry in the future. China is the dominant global player in refining strategic minerals. It refines 68% of the nickel, 40% of the copper, 59% of the lithium, and 73% of the cobalt globally. It is also a strategic player in downstream stages of the battery supply chain. China manufactures 70% of the cathodes, which are the most important battery component, as well as 85% of the anodes. Of course, the reason China has been able to leap ahead is the investments China has made in that EV supply chain, primarily by distorting the free market. By reshoring and friendshoring advanced transportation manufacturing from minerals to markets, we can ultimately end our reliance on foreign entities of concern. While China has a significant head start, the US and our partners are beginning to sprint to catch up. For these trends to continue, the EV market needs to reliably expand. While an EV might not be right for every consumer right now, with EVs delivering longer and longer ranges, the vast majority of drivers' needs are now easily met with EV options and with cheaper cost per mile prices. But the national security imperative of retaining US manufacturing competitiveness is in this transition has been downplayed by those seeking to pull EVs into some sort of culture war. A lot of misinformation has been shared, and unfortunately, EVs have been portrayed by some as a partisan issue. The EC is committed to maintaining this momentum we've seen in the EV transition, and we agree with the 18 Republican members of Congress who recently signed a letter to their leadership supporting the manufacturing incentive of the IRA tax provisions. EVs are not a red issue, not a blue issue, but truly a red, white, and blue issue. We're asking all veterans attending today's webinar to use your respected nonpartisan voices in a unified call to support the continuation of the federal EV investments and add your name to the Veterans Sign-On Letter to the Washington, which we are launching today. We'll put the link in the chat and ask you to add your name and rank and branch, and we'll send the letter out to new leaders in Washington, reminding them of the nonpartisan value of maintaining American manufacturing competitiveness, helping deliver increased national security and more job opportunities for veterans and support for our auto industry. With that, I'm very excited to turn the webinar over to our impressive panel of veterans who are leading the way in the EV transition and will help answer key questions and challenges we face as a nation as we manage this historic shift. Thank you for that, and I'd like to now introduce Marcy Bauer, the Senior VP for Development at EVgo. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, General Wald. Really appreciate that. And welcome everyone. We do have a terrific panel for you today. We represent a wide range of perspectives within the EV ecosystem. I will ask each to introduce themselves to give a better sense of their veteran lineage and how that flows into interacting with the grid on the civilian side of things. And I'll set the example here by kicking things off and introducing myself. As General Wald said, I'm Marcy Bauer. I started my career in the Army's Military Intelligence Corps, wove my way from there through environmental health and science and then into clean transportation. And now I am currently leading the EV fast charger deployment effort for EVgo. That means that we work very closely with utilities across the US, planning and forecasting and deploying EV fast charging sites really all over the country. And so just to very briefly put a finer point on the notion of EV demand, give a little bit of foundation to this panel discussion. This week during earnings call, our EVgo CEO shared that EV sales are outpacing fast charger deployment. So it's not just EV sales are up, as General Wald shared in his opening remarks. Rideshare electrification is up. Charger utilization is up. I am one of those people who regularly annoys my family by stopping to chat with folks who are charging. I just pepper them with questions. And so anecdotally, I've encountered all of these trends firsthand in the wild. There are more and more diverse and affordable makes and models coming out. I see those at the chargers. All of this is in combination driving EVIO forecasts out to 2020, 2030 and beyond, just trending drastically upward. So there's this age-old saying about necessity and invention, and that's where we find ourselves right now. We are faced with a need, and that need doubles as an opportunity. So with that little preamble out of the way, I will go ahead and introduce the panel, and we'll start with Sarah Nielsen.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so thankful to be here. So I served in the Army where I was an environmental engineer. So my job was to keep soldiers healthy and in the fight. So I traveled all over wherever we had soldiers stationed to inspect the site conditions. And so I took away two things from this. One was a deep appreciation for infrastructure that we have in the States, because when you're tasked with making sure that air, soil, and water are clean in every site, that people have good food, and that they're safe from vector-borne diseases, you get a big appreciation for the infrastructure that we have here in the US. And so that was a big motivator for me to move into the utility space. And the second big takeaway for me was a passion for electric vehicles. General Wald did an amazing job highlighting the big macro issues around national security and EVs. And so I'll just add one that's a very micro issue, but just a very local one, which is, as I was traveling around the battlefield, almost every time I was traveling by land, it was in a fuel convoy because we had to get fuel out to where the soldiers were. That is one of the biggest reasons that soldiers are on the roads, is to move fuel to vehicles. And I just saw that, and I just know that even if we were to replace some of those tactical vehicles with ones that could work off electricity and could generate their fuel on site, it would mean a world of difference to the soldiers and their safety. So that's a big motivator for me. It's a far cry from what I'm doing in the day-to-day, but I keep that in the back of my mind. And I know that whatever progress we can make here in the US is going to ultimately help in our contingency operations as well. So for the last 8 years, I was working at Consumers Energy, one of the major utilities in Michigan. And when I got there, we started our electric vehicle programs, and we now have programs for residential, public, fast charging, fleet charging, all that. So excited to be here and to contribute to the conversation.
Thanks so much, Sarah. It's a little awkward without a live audience. If we had a live audience, I would immediately ask for hand raises on who's had that experience of being in a fuel convoy or behind a fuel convoy, or trying to get from one side of a fuel convoy to the other one. So I know that's definitely relatable to me. I'm sure many, many others in the audience as well. So thanks for that. Let's go on to Bill.
Thanks, Marcy. I'm Bill Holcomb. I was formerly in the Army as a Signal Corps member many, many years ago. And although there doesn't seem to be a direct correlation between my military job and my public job, I think I learned a lot in the service as far as being able to think for myself, having, all of being able to have the order on our daily process, which led me into Pontiac schools in Pontiac, Michigan. I'm currently tasked with transitioning their fleet vehicles from ICE to electric for buses, cargo vans, utility vehicles, as well as converting our plant energy to sustainable energy, such as solar panels. In Pontiac, I think our vision is a little bit unique for many school districts. So not only are we preparing for the buses, the electric buses, to support our students, but we also want to take a holistic view, if you will, on how we can support the community in general. So being able to plan for things like catastrophic events, taking out buses, parking them out in neighborhoods, using them for people to charge their phones, small medical devices. All of our vehicles will have Wi-Fi in them, so they can jump on the internet. And kids continue to work if we have long-term outages, as well as supporting our local municipality for their future vehicles that are coming online, using our charging stations to charge up police vehicles, fire vehicles, all of those day-to-day vehicles that come in hand with the with the municipalities. So I thank you for your time, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thanks, Bill. And on the flip side of the relatability, that description that you gave of the school bus experience definitely sounds very different from my school bus experience of my youth. So I guess time marches on, progress is unstoppable, and all of that. So thanks for that. And then we'll have Norm introduce himself.
Hi, thanks, Marcy. I'm Norm Campbell, former Air Force flight line officer, worked on aircraft, heavies in particular, 135s, and currently work at Siemens, where I'm actually in charge of our electrification and EV program for federal. So I live and breathe this every single day, trying to help the federal government get to that next stage. Back in my days when I was on the flight line, it was a lot of age equipment or ground equipment, and it's all petrol based, and there's a lot of fumes. to say the least. And we're helping with the Air Force to electrify the flight line equipment. So one, it's a little quieter. Two, it's a little healthier. And three, it's a little more portable. So this, the EVs aren't just related to electric vehicles, but we're talking about other equipment that the military is going to be using to meet their mission. That's going to be non-fuel based. So I'm excited about the future, and I'm really happy to be here.
Thanks, Norm. That's a really good reminder that transportation isn't just vehicles and especially individual personally owned vehicles. It's a lot bigger than that. And the emissions footprint therefore is a lot bigger than that as well. Certainly recall the multi-sensory experience of that diesel in the morning kind of vibe that we had in the service. So, all right, let's get into it. We've got sort of a provocative panel title here. It's based on concerns I'm sure we've all heard before about the prospects of EVs overwhelming the electrical grid. It's all very dramatic sounding stuff. But I know this group in particular would never shy away from a really tough question. So we're going to name the elephant in the room. We're going to steer into the skid. We're going to charge the front door. Sarah, Bill, Norman, will EVs crash the grid?
Well, I'll take a first go at this one. As an ex-utility employee, I don't see that happening, right? We are adding EVs at a record pace. There's no doubt about that, right? And there's some infrastructure issues that need to be addressed. But from a perspective of crashing the grid, the adoption of EVs is going to be at a pace where the utility companies can address and adjust, and they are. There's a lot of advents that are coming out in the utility space that are going to address long-term supply. So from my perspective and what I've seen, I don't see that being an issue whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll agree with Norman. I think we asked ourselves this 8 years ago when we were starting off, really digging into this. And what we have found is exactly what Norman's saying. On the residential side, there's definitely an increase in momentum, but it's a slow tide, and it's something that we can track and see coming. Every EV owner that joins our program, we note their address and we mark their transformer. So we know exactly how many EVs are on at the transformer level. The ones that aren't on our program, we still know their zip codes. And so we are really watching closely. I say we, Consumers Energy is really watching closely where those EVs are going. Where at the neighborhood level, a transformer might be starting to get overloaded and might need to be replaced sooner than later. So just double clicking into what Norman was saying about how the utility tracks that at the residential level. And then if you think about the medium and heavy duty side, everyone's probably seen an Amazon electric truck at this point, hopefully. And they're not the only ones that are going electric. It's easy to think, well, that could crash the grid potentially. But when you get to that level of charging, those actually start to just look like a factory that's going in, or a warehouse, or a data center. I mean, they are not going to be opening those operations without a heads up to the utility years in advance to plan for those. It's very different from the consumer that can go out and buy an EV this weekend and then just plug in, right? They're not working with us right away, but those medium and heavy duty fleet operators are. And so at that point, it looks like anything else that is a heavy load that's coming into the utility that we know how to handle. And that process isn't perfect. We'll go into that too, but it is something that we know how to do.
Yeah, I'll echo Norman and Sarah's comments. I don't foresee any impact or undue impact on the grid. Buses for schools, we have to be reliable. If we don't pick kids up that day, there's going to be hell to pay for someone, namely me. So being able to work with our utility company well in advance of rolling this stuff out, and then also having backup plans. So in case something does happen for long term, we still have the ability to charge our vehicles, again, either through solar, natural gas generators, hydrogen generators. We've hopefully planned for those shortfalls. But yeah, I don't see any undue pressure on the grid.
Advanced and contingency planning, also very relatable. Sarah, you mentioned consumers marking new EV owners. I wonder if I can ask you to elaborate on that a little bit. We know that EV adoption is sort of the more positive version of contagiousness, right? It's contagious. So you see one EV pop up on a block, usually within a very short period of time. Other neighbors who've noticed that tend to also lean into the EV wave a little bit. And so it's not, it doesn't just add one and one makes two. It becomes this exponential growth type of factor. Is that being accounted for?
It is very much. What's been nice about this is that we've been able to mature our data analytics capability in the last 8 years as well. So as we see who's buying those EVs, we're also improving our algorithm to understand where they might go next. So exactly, you're right, Marcy. This looks like this neighborhood is, or this development is probably primed for something. Let's keep an eye on that transformer. So we've got all these characteristics around who's most likely to buy an EV, and that can play into then we overlay that on our system to say, where are the transformers that might pop red first? And then what we are increasingly doing at consumers then is then tying that in with what transformers are getting old and might need to get replaced soon. And so which ones do we want to place first? So it's all, the good news is that the EV piece is not this totally separate planning function. It has become incorporated into the macro way that the utility is looking at which transformers need to get replaced when. We have this data now in the last 8 years about who's most likely to buy the EV, which neighborhoods are popping hot, et cetera.
Yeah, exactly. Wonderful. All right. Thanks, everyone. Let's go a little deeper now on grid resiliency. I've got a two-parter coming up for you. So EVs sometimes pointed to as a culprit for increasing grid stress, as the whole title of this panel kind of suggests. But we also have these ever increasing, ever expanding data center needs, myriad other grid demands coming hot. Goldman Sachs predicts that computing will be anywhere between 8 and 11% of US power demand by 2030, on top of the EVIO increase that I mentioned at the top. So that computing sector alone could require up to 240 gigawatts of new generation, depending on the power mix, plus the EVs. Part one of the question, are EVs really the main challenge? Part two, how can we strategically manage EV adoption alongside those other very significant grid pressures? Sarah, do you want to dive in on that one?
Yeah, happy to start. I think that what's helpful to think about with EVs is not only can we manage them to not be a burden to the grid, like we all were just saying, but they can actually be a benefit to the grid when used correctly. And that is unique in terms of other types of energy sources. So take your data centers, which are magnitudes higher in energy needs than EVs, like magnitudes. That data center, from the day it turns on, it's going to use X amount of gigawatts of energy forever. It's never going to turn off. Hopefully, it's never going to need to go up or down. They can't respond to storms or anything. It's just on and running. That's very different from an EV, where even on the fleet side, they can predict when they're going to need to charge and when they're not. On the residential side, you've got even more flexibility about when people can charge. And I know where your Marcy, where your world is, and also Bill as well, is like we're moving towards a world where those can actually even be putting energy back into the grid. So I think it's important to frame EVs as not only can we manage them to not be a burden, but they can actually be a big benefit, which is very different from these other energy sources.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Bill, Norm, anything to add?
Yeah, I would say that something that you mentioned earlier, Marcy, about innovation. There are systems right now for EVs that allow for charging balance. So by that, I mean, let's say, for instance, you have 20 EVs on your system. Via software, I can manage the charging cycles very easily to meet whatever requirements I would have, or if the utilities ask the question, then we could match into their system very easily. So now I'm maybe only charging at half power for 10 of my vehicles, and then I switch that off. But those kind of technologies are already there, and they're going to be enhanced. So I don't see that being a strain on the grid per se. Much like Sarah mentioned, I think it's a benefit because now you've got load disbursement and you've got the ability to manage those kind of loads. And as grid to vehicle or vehicle to grid becomes more of a reality, again, you're talking about a storage capability. So I
Yeah,
think,
it's a battery on wheels. It's a energy storage rolling around out in the wild. And one of the things that we saw in the very earliest days of the industry was, especially in California, where they were experiencing almost the reverse issues of the rest of the country, where they had all of this generation and not enough offtake, not enough load to draw down on it during the day. We saw that the earliest days of what essentially is rideshare electrification was balancing that quite effectively, because they wanted to charge at the time when the max, solar generation was happening. So those things, there are ways to innovatively manage that and even drive that, right? All right. So let's go on to the next one. And really, no webinar is complete without a little bit of myth busting. I feel like it's obligatory for these things. So I want to ask, what are the most significant misconceptions about EV's impact on grid stability?
well, I'll take a quick shot at this one. An EV, if you're looking at an EV and grid stability, one EV is 100 kWh, right? So to put that in perspective, it's a really small point load. So even if you have a lot of them, they would have to act in unison to affect the grid, right? So you would have much more of a challenge from, say, a large point source, say a data center going offline or coming back online, to impact grid stability than you would have a 10 or 15 or 20 or 1,000 EVs that are operating in a disjointed manner. So if they can't coordinate, then they can't really impact the utility in that perspective. And then you've got infrastructure, like some of this infrastructure that we provide in between, that buffer that. So I think that's a big misconception that an EV can impact the grid in that perspective.
Great. Thanks so much, Norm. Anyone else have anything to add to that?
So just to extrapolate a little bit on Norm's last comments in conjunction with this, I think there are software programs. I mean, we're planning on using programs to set thresholds on how much energy the buses can consume, and then to flip that, how much we're sending back into the grid. So that's a big part of the fleet operations when you're looking at it from that standpoint.
Great. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, I mean, just a quick anecdote on how far we're coming so quickly. Early adopters are always like the most gung-ho about technologies. And there was one of my colleagues years ago, that was one of the first people in our program. And that was back when you had to go out and manually plug in your car to start it, right? And one day he had to go out there and do that, and actually ended up like falling and breaking his ankle. And we felt terrible, but we gave him like a program like VIP status or something, because he was so dedicated. So just a quick anecdote, how much easier it is now. I mean, on the residential side now, you set it into your car and you don't have to think about it ever again. You don't have to go there out at night to plug it in. And it gets even easier and more sophisticated on the fleet side, as Bill and Norman are saying.
Yeah, that's a really good reminder. I mean, the industry does get its fair share probably of attention on all manner of things that complicate things for the average consumer, because we are moving well past that early adopter stage. And for the average consumer, it really just needs to be easy and something you don't have to think about. And while we might not be fully there yet, it's certainly a far cry from where things started. There's been massive improvements along the way, and just more of that to come. So thanks, Sarah. Appreciate that. All right, I'm going to move on to V to G and some emergency preparedness talk. So EVs, they are good for more than just a torquey ride that you can refuel in your garage. They are incredibly fun to drive. They're quiet. They're cheaper to maintain, all sorts of good things. But they're also, as I mentioned earlier, and as we kind of teed up, I think almost by accident earlier, they're rolling energy storage. They can be a grid resource. So as EVs of all shapes and sizes, again, we're getting different makes and models out there for the personal use consumer and for fleet use as well. So as EVs of all shapes and sizes become more prevalent, what role might bidirectional charging and vehicle-to-grid technology play in enhancing grid resiliency and flexibility? I think that one's for Bill.
Sure. Thanks, Marcy. I'll be happy to take that. So in Pontiac, we were very intentional on our journey into EVs and looking at bidirectional capabilities. So when we were looking at going down this path, we wanted to make sure that the buses we purchased had bidirectional capabilities, the chargers we had were bidirectional, and that our utility company could work with that as well, so that we could connect to them at some point. So I think as we can all recognize, as we have storms going across the nation, it seems everyone that rolls through is just a little bit more powerful than the last one that came through. You know, we're breaking rainfall records and freeze records and heat records all across the board. So having something in place to help the community, I think, can address some of those problems. So in Pontiac, what we've done is, as we do building renovations or plan for new buildings, the EV infrastructure is absolutely part of that initial planning. So the intent would be at one of our schools, for instance, to have an EV charger, DCFC charger aligned with the building for not only staff to charge up the vehicles, but should something occur, we can pull up a bus, support life safety within the building. So if we need to use the gymnasium, for instance, as a shelter for the local subdivisions, we can do that. And we can, you know, I think what we projected was we could support an elementary gymnasium for about 3 days off of a bus. So we would have a plan to roll through those buses, you know, if the event goes on longer than that. And then as far as the V2G, it's exciting for us because that becomes, for the school district, a revenue source. So we were very fortunate to receive funding from the EPA for our buses and infrastructure, with some money out of pocket from the district, of course. But as we look at when our utility company is ready to receive energy back from us, we have a fleet of 40 buses that can send energy back and help that resiliency of the grid.
Great, thanks so much, Bill. You mentioned a few things that seem, correct me if I'm wrong, are already in deployment, in use. Is there anything next gen on the horizon for bidirectional things that, you know, are being explored and aren't quite rolled out yet?
So not necessarily bi-directional, but we've given a lot of forethought to second life of batteries of these vehicles. Are very large, very heavy, very cumbersome. So our plan is to create basically battery storage sheds with solar panels to charge those batteries, to trickle charge them, and then use those at the buildings for additional energy storage as well.
Oh, great. Thanks so much. And since we're doing so great for time so far, I want to make sure, Sarah and Norm, anything to add on the bidirectional V2G piece?
Not for me. That was great.
I have one follow-up in the vein of myth busting again. So Bill kind of steered into it a little bit with the increasing severity of storms. Certainly, we've seen upticks in frequency and severity of natural disasters. In my home state of North Carolina, this is very much still top of mind in Western Carolina, being hit by Hurricane Helene so hard. Are you guys still encountering this? But what do you do with EV? You know, how do EVs fare in a disaster? And, you know, how are you going to get your power? And they'll never work for that sort of thing. Are you still encountering that? And what's your response to it? And this is open to anyone.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely, you know, something when we're out in the communities talking about EVs, that is often something that comes up. And I usually point out that when the power is out, gas stations do not work either. But I think there is something just very deep-seated in people's heads about, like, I can see the fuel in my tank and I have that fuel. That's just hard to bypass. So I think some of this is going to be like a battery solution, like Bill said, like as communities or people who are really passionate or worried about this find their own kind of battery solutions to feel good about it. And some of it's just going to have to be the systems, the utilities and the grid proving that they are ready for storms, and they can get back online quickly, and they can do it without, hampering people's ability to charge and drive. There's various things you can do. We all, as in the utility space, whenever there's a storm, a big storm, there's always community outreach we do to make sure that people have places to go for warmth, that they can get food, etc. So you can easily imagine EV charging in that space as well. So I think there's a bunch of these things we can do, but it is something we hear a lot, Marcy.
Thanks, Sarah. Bill, Norm?
Well, from what I see I primarily work with federal customers. It is something that there's some discussion of, but the contingency planning is being put in place. I think Bill brought up a really good point about second use or extended life of batteries. Just because it doesn't match what it's supposed to be doing doesn't mean it's not useful. And repurposing is exactly the kind of thing that needs to happen. And to Sarah's point, that kind of repurposing can give you fuel stations that don't necessarily require electricity to be able to charge a vehicle or something along those lines. And as we evolve in this market space, more of those solutions are going to be developed, and they're going to be available for folks to use. So I hear the comments, but industry and innovation move much faster. We find a need, we'll fill a need.
Well, I couldn't agree more, Norm. We hear that a lot too. Well, what about at the end of the battery life? And it's like, that's the last thing I'm worried about. There are going to be people fighting over these batteries or the parts within them, right? Like that, I'm not worried about that.
Agreed.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. All right, I'm going to pivot over to microgrids a little bit. The DoD conducts critical missions at over 500 military installations all over the U.S. I remember a lot of back 40 exercises back in the dinosaur times, but these days, over 99% of these missions rely on some kind of, commercial electrical grid connection for their power. Many military bases are essentially small towns in a lot of ways. So considering DoD's mission critical power requirements, what are the key technical, economic, strategic advantages of implementing microgrids? These are, these localized, self-contained electrical systems at military installations in particular, and how does transportation electrification play into that? And I think I'll tack Norm for that one.
Well, thanks, Marcy. I live and breathe that every single day in my work. DoD has made a concerted effort for putting more resiliency in place on their bases to meet mission requirements. And the Army has already stated that they're going to have a microgrid on every base by 2030. And they're working towards that now. Right now, it's more focused on mission critical infrastructure. And that means, controls, communications, specific activities on facilities. And it's a mix of resources. So solar, there's going to be natural gas generation. One to look for that's going to be growing is Watch Eielson Air Force Base, small modular nuclear reactor. It's only 5 megawatts, but it's going to be the first one of its kind. You're going to see more of that as we move forward. And that also precipitates the need for having good controls. Storage has to be included in this. These projects are not inexpensive, but they are required to keep the military moving. And they've come to this conclusion. They're stepping on the gas. They're leaning into it, and there are a lot of microgrid projects going on right now of different varying sizes and performance. So I see this as a space that's going to be very busy for the next 20 years.
Excellent. Thanks, Norm. And so that you gave one specific example of an Air Force base, I think you said, for microgrid in the military world. What about the civilian world? So, where and what are the advantages of application in the civilian world? Are there any differences that are notable?
The differences, I think, is more focused on keeping the business up. So if you look at, say, a data center, Sarah mentioned before, they need to run. They can't just, they have to function. If the data centers aren't working, then our phones don't work, our data, our computers have problems. So they look at hardening their facilities as well. In the past, I've worked with Amazon. They need to keep their their cars, trucks filled with product. So they need to be able to have certain capabilities at their warehouses to get to keep things moving. So it's more of a focus on their business, which is their mission, like DoD. But you're seeing more of an advent of that. I think JFK Airport is putting in 8 microgrids, and that's to make sure that the airport functions under adverse conditions. But it's also a economic capability too, because just because you have a microgrid doesn't mean that it's just there as an insurance policy. Much like Bill was talking about feeding power back into the grid, a microgrid can be an ability for someone to remove off the grid to ease some of the strain for the utility, or be demand management or demand response. And those actually can be, those will be paid for. The utilities actually have programs, and Sarah can explain that a lot better than I can, that will pay customers to be flexible. And so now you've got a microgrid that actually can help pay for itself. And EVs are part of that storage function as bidirectional becomes more and more available and mainstream. That gives a lot of flexibility.
Sarah, your name got said. You want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess just to add a little color if people out there aren't familiar with utility programs, because they do vary state to state. But states will put forth laws that basically incentivize the utility to sell less power, for example. So it incentivizes the utility to promote energy efficiency, for example, or to be able to like buy back solar or buy back power from a battery. So in Norm's example, if you could picture a microgrid, yes, there's an investment made to pay for that microgrid, but then if that community does a certain amount of energy efficiency projects, they can get paid for that. If they are selling or exporting their power back to the grid, they could get paid for that. And like every single state is going to have different business models for that, but that's in essence the idea.
Great, thanks so much. I'm going to move down to more of a closing question so we can leave a little bit of time for audience Q&A, because we do have some questions that are popping up. So let's, it's not even Thanksgiving yet. Holiday music is streaming everywhere. Let's put together our own little gift list here. Bringing it back to the title of the panel session, we've already established none of us on this panel think that EVs are going to crash the grid, but there are a lot of different impediments at the strategic and tactical level that we really didn't have time to get into really deeply here. What would you put on your, what would you ask for from utilities, utility regulators, policymakers, other stakeholders in this space? What do we want them to deliver that would unlock easier, faster, better response to that hockey stick of EV presence in their mix of load demand? And this is free for all for anyone.
So I'll jump in first. I would like to see as my Christmas gift, our utility companies or public service commissions being thoughtful and forward thinking, knowing that the EVs are coming down the line, being able to set up, how they buy back those that energy, what those rates are looking like, because that seems to be a big impediment right now, at least where I'm at. We just don't know. So I can't forecast my budget because I don't know what those costs are going to be. So that's my present.
It's a good one.
I have 2 things on my list. One is related to Bill's, the nitty gritty of, this is a revolution and it's going to take a different approach. And so I think utilities need to take a different approach to this. Commissions and lawmakers need to incentivize them to take that different approach. It can't be a nitty gritty nickel and dime cost benefit of each charger that's deployed and trying to calculate that back, because that's not what's going to get to a tipping point here. So I think there needs to be an innovative approach to this, a little bit of trust extended around, here's a pot of money, here's what we want you to realize with that benefit, but go forth and do what you think needs to happen to get there. I think that would be really motivating and a little bit freeing, so that we do have time to try different things, because not everything is going to work. And then my second thing is just for everyone, just more fast chargers out there. Even if they are never used, they need to be there to give people the confidence to buy a car.
We're working on it.
Yeah, keep going.
I think my Christmas present would be for regulators to actually engage with us in industry a little more effectively, to understand what we're building, what we can build, what's possible, and so that their policies can reflect the reality of what industry can provide to the end user. So to be more thoughtful and understanding where the road is headed, as opposed to using, like Sarah said, little small bits and pieces and existing thinking patterns. Look to the next level, right? For instance, would be engage in things like allow folks to engage in things like digital twin technologies, which are fast coming out, to be able to game the systems, to understand how it's going to work before you even install it, and then have your policies reflected based on that that reality.
Excellent. Thanks to everyone. I'm going to pivot now to questions from the audience. So I've been scanning through on the side a little bit just to make sure that we've got good ones teed up for you, good tough ones teed up for you. And I'm going to start with one for you, Sarah. We've got, I'm assuming, someone from representing a small municipal electric utility, which is wonderful. They want to know, they want to better know where the grid may need a new transformer. Can you say what software frameworks would support this, or just give a little bit more insight into tools that are available to help support that kind of forecasting of new transformer needs?
Oh my. I might have to think about the exact ones, because that was always the engineering team. So I guess my best answer for today can be, it's a combination of qualitative analysis, understanding your demographics, and so understanding where people live on your grid. So that's all like demographic information, propensity data around who's most likely to buy an EV, and then pairing it with what I think they're asking about, which is software that can then look at the system and pair that. So I don't know exactly what that is, but it is out there, so you can find it.
Excellent. It's the right question to ask, though, and there's lots of resources to help find that. So good luck. I hope you find it not at all for selfish reasons. All right, I've got one for Bill. In Madison, New Jersey, this audience member is actively pursuing electrification of the municipal fleet and buildings. They're actively working with their school district regarding electrification of their fleet and buildings. The district is too small to have a dedicated green person. Is there a training program that you could suggest to school facilities directors to attend so that they could become that green champion and be able to advocate and expert more effectively on relevant issues?
Gosh, I wish it were that easy. I could use some training back when I started this. I think I'm not aware of specific training that's out there for that yet, but there's great resources out there. So the Electrification Coalition has wonderful resources for people to reach out to. A lot of the Department of Educations within the states have resources to look at the electric vehicles and kind of use a cooperative approach to getting those vehicles into places.
Great, thanks, Bill. Appreciate that. There's a question about costs. So, you know, utilities, we've already established, I think, pretty definitively that can handle the EV demand that's coming without completely breaking the grid, but there is investment that's required. How can those investments be made without increasing cost to consumers? Can utilities change their cost benefit analyses? Do they need to even to be able to bring forward the benefits of things like batteries and other technologies to reduce long-term pressure on rates? So this is, you know, this all sounds like great stuff, but is it just going to make my utility bill go up, and how can we avoid it doing that?
So I think I'm really glad they asked this, because this is a fine point that I wanted to make. When we talk about EVs being a benefit and not a burden to the grid, every utility has as much power as going to be needed for that hottest day in the summer. You have to have that ready, but 99% of the time you're not using that much. So every utility has extra power generation that's just ready to be used. It doesn't require any more investment, any more spending to get it. It's already there. So as much as we can promote charging during those times when it's not already being used, you're effectively gaining that revenue without having to put any cost into the system. You're basically taking the money from the gas station and putting it into the utility. And so what that then does is lowers the cost for everyone on the grid, because that's more revenue that the utility has realized without having to spend. So that's more money that the utility has to reinvest back into the system without having to raise rates. So it's a nuanced point, but I'm glad they brought it up, because I think that's another very powerful benefit of EVs for the grid.
Great, thanks, Sarah. I kind of want to revert back to one of the questions that we sidebarred, kind of steered away from earlier. What would you say, what would all of you say to someone who says planning for the future of and investing in our grid in these ways is just not a priority right now? Choose your words kindly, I guess.
I think you have to rethink that. I think it absolutely is a priority. The EVs aren't going away. Again, back to the climate change, we've seen the effects that weather and climate are having on our country and the world. We have to come up with a better solution. We just have to.
Not optional. Got it.
Yes, I would agree with Bill's statement on that one. The train's left the station. EVs are here. They're going to be a mix of part of what we're going to be doing. Are we only going to have EVs? I don't think so. There'll be if you listen to a lot of the automobile manufacturers, it's going to be a broad mix of different fueling sources per se. But you need to prepare. You need to plan. So you can't just ignore it. It won't go away, and you've got to address it. And I think what I'm seeing, DoD is addressing it in different ways than even I imagined. So if you can think of going to some of the trade shows like AUSA, you find out some of the new technology that's coming out that's electric based. And so, yeah, you need to lean into this and get ready.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. What can state public utility commissions do to help accelerate all of this? But the question is the audience member question is specific to V2G, but I'd like to open it up a little bit more broadly even than that.
Yeah, I'll repeat what I said earlier in a slightly different way, which is the historical way that commissions and utilities interacted was, here are all the upgrades and how much I think they're going to cost to do. Those upgrades and those things to the system, they didn't change for decades. So there is a very written in stone process to evaluate costs and benefits of these things. And so my ask is, we have to think about these costs and benefits differently. We are going to have to try several things. Some might be more effective than others. It might be really difficult to understand exactly which of those 5 things caused the person to buy the EV, right? And so that's where it's like, we need to think about this different. It's not the same as upgrading a substation. We have to have a more kind of fluid definition of costs and benefits and what success looks like.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Any other responses to that one?
I'll throw in state regulators as well in that we have to make sure that our regulators are up to date on the technologies that are out there. There are going to be challenges that we have, and they have to be flexible enough to work with the clientele and the companies to come up with the best solutions, not just what's been on the books for the last 50 years. This is a new era, so they need to get with the times.
Excellent. All right, so there are several questions in the audience from the audience members that are different flavors of kind of the same thing, which is this just general uncertainty and anxiety around what comes next. We've got a new administration coming in, and just what does that do to all of this momentum and this these programs and this these trends and the technologies that we're working on and the programs that are already proving themselves out. So just, uncertainty breeds anxiety, right? That's the situation that I think a lot of people are facing right now. What are you guys focused on in response to that?
I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh,
I think it's about staying the course and continuing. We know what the benefits are. We know what they can be for the individual driver, for our grid, for our security. It's about staying the course. My most optimistic read of this is the partisanship that EVs have been dragged into, that General Wald discussed, hopefully gets stripped away a bit, and we can get back to what are the actual pros and cons here. How can we use these as a way to improve national security and environment and business in the US?
Yeah, my fun little quippy one-liner on this, and I really do believe it, so it's easy to say, is that in my view, based on everything I've seen, everything I've studied and analyzed and read from researchers, really studying cradle to grave impacts, and before I threw my hat all the way in the ring for EVs, is that EVs are the most patriotic thing you can drive. That's how I feel about it. Any other thought? Norm, anything you want to add?
Oh, I think there was a lot of angst with the changes that are coming, but the processes have been in place and people are working on the systems. And more importantly, when I deal with the federal government, the agencies are still, they're still looking forward and moving forward. And they'll continue to do that because it's going to be, again, they see it as a resilience play.
Yes.
And that's really, really critical. So I don't have a crystal ball on that one, to say the least. And I could wake up tomorrow and things would be turned upside down. But what I'm seeing is a continued march forward in leveraging this new technology.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate that. It's probably a good question to end on, and also foot stomping the veteran sign-on letter, which I'm sure General Wald will mention again as well. But I really appreciate all of your time. I appreciate the thoughtful questions from the audience members as well. It's tough to not be able to see you guys, taking all of this really interesting information in and critical information in to get a better idea of just how unstoppable this train is, but what all is being done to make sure that it sails smoothly.
Okay, well, first of all, fascinating discussion. I could listen to this, believe me, a lot longer. I will say this: I've been involved with SAFE and ESLC for quite a while now. I don't even want to say how long, but it's a national security issue, literally. And it doesn't matter how you come down on politically one way or the other. This is about America's security, economic security, but also just our national security writ large. And so I'd like to personally add my thanks to Marcy and Bill, Norm, and Sarah for fascinating discussion, very, very insightful and important. And I'd like to thank all the people that participated in the webinar via this podcast today, particularly the veterans, and thank you for your service to our country. And Veterans Day was recently, and that's a good reason to have this. But I really appreciate it a lot. Your voices, all of you, mean a lot in Washington. I've spent a lot of time in DC, and the government leadership listens to the military, active duty as well as retired, and that constituency can't be overemphasized enough. So if you want to call into the chat area, there's a webinar sign-in area there that you can sign the letter with your name, rank, and branch of service, and we'll get it to the right people in Washington, D.C. that are in charge of making these decisions. I know if they were all listening to this webinar, they would probably sign whatever the legislation has to be to do that. I'll just make a real quick anecdote I know we're running late here, but I just had my own personal home generator put in yesterday, completed, and I've always wanted one. I feel good about it. My neighbor has a Tesla charger in his garage, and he can charge his car right at home with a 220. He loves it. Goes like a bat out of you-know-what. I've driven it. And when everybody else is losing power and everything else, I'm going to have my charger in my garage with my Tesla or whatever car you get. And I'll have a charged up full tank of gas with electric gas, and that's going to make it pretty secure for me. But again, thank you all for what you've done. Thank you for this great discussion, and thank you, veterans, for what you've done for our country. Thank you.